everybody. My name is Gus Fonte. I'm the moderator for today's panel, and I'm going to have my panel members do a quick introduction before we start. You can go ahead first.
Good morning, everybody. I am Natividad Soto. I'm an architect. My company, Ferguson Glasgow Schuster Soto, has been around for many years. Not me, but the company. But I'm also really involved with the American Institute of Architects, and some of these subjects that we've talked about today are really critical to our members, the architectural community. And I thank you for inviting me here today to tell a little bit about what we do and how we can speed up the process for you guys.
Good morning, my name is George Cuesta. I have a construction firm, Cuesta Construction, that I founded with two of my brothers about 22 years ago. We concentrate in commercial construction. We do a lot of historical restoration work, boutique hotels in South Beach. Like Nati, I also am very involved in associations for my industry. I'm currently the chairman for the state of Florida for Associated Builders and Contractors, and we work very closely with the AIA as well to stay on top of the issues that affect our industry, which basically is your industry as well. So it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for welcoming.
Hi, good morning, everybody. I'm Alex Tachmes, partner at Schutz & Bowen Law Firm and chair of the firm's zoning and land use practice. I've been at the firm for about 12 years, and those of you who haven't heard of Schutz, been around since 1910. It's Miami's oldest law firm, 300 lawyers and 8 offices around Florida. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Before we start, if you have questions while we're going, raise your hand and I'll call on you so we can kind of do this as interactive instead of waiting till the end where we forgot the question we wanted to ask. How many people in this room have been involved in either a redevelopment or a repurposing of an existing facility? Can you raise your hands? All right, so it's about 25%. What I want to start the discussion is with what are overall in the panel are we seeing today in terms of those two, repurposing and redevelopment? What are we seeing?
Well, one of the things that we've noticed in the architectural community is a huge push to repurposing, because it's a more resilient way, more sustainable way of conducting our business. And also we are seeing a lot of historic preservation and restoration projects that it's not an easy thing to go into a building and change its use tremendously, but it's a lot less expensive than building a new building. And if it's a significant building that makes the fabric of the community what it is, as a developer, as a real estate agent, as a contractor, and as an architect, I think we have the responsibility to do that, to make that effort, to make that building alive again, instead of demolishing it and creating more waste.
Yeah, like I said, I do a lot of work at historical buildings in the city of Miami Beach, which I think the city of Miami Beach, when you look at what they've done from a historical preservation perspective, I think it's top notch. So sometimes it's limiting for developers that want to go in and sort of repurpose, the site. However, what they've done over the course of time is really developed an area that is unique to South Florida, and they've kept property values up, right? Because if you're not able to develop as much, the ones that are there and have to stay at that level, they tend to go up. And you're talking about South Beach, where it has become, an international marketplace. So the historical preservation portion of it through redevelopment, I think, has been key to the city of Miami Beach and to the areas in general. And I think you're going to see more of that, right? So for a while, it was all about Art Deco, and I think now North Beach is trying to implement some of its own historical preservation that are going to be buildings that were designed in maybe in the 60s, late 60s, and the 70s, that may not have that same allure that we have towards the Art Deco buildings during our generation, but as time goes by, it reflects certain things that were going on during the development at that time. So I think you're going to continue to see a push towards preservation and having to work with the structures that are there. You do see some redevelopment or repurposing. I had a client that we built, it was a church client, and we did probably 4 churches throughout the country from Miami to Brooklyn, and they're old movie theaters. And when you look at it, movie theaters are an ideal venue for a church, right? I mean, the old movie theaters had one screen, they had a pitched floor, you can remove all the seats, put in pews, And, they were beautiful historic buildings. One of them built in the 1930s here in Miami, and another one built in the 1920s in Brooklyn, and a couple of, more modern things. But as I think redevelopment and historical preservation go hand in hand, and I think you can see where there's a lot of structures that we can repurpose, preserve, and increase property value too. So I see it as an ongoing trend.
Yeah, I think that we're seeing a lot more repurposing and redevelopment now than ground-up construction. So there's a lot of, there isn't much in terms of vacant land, and so we're seeing clients decide to repurpose existing uses and buildings rather than doing demolition and starting new construction. So, and for your clients out there, the savvy clients who know how to repurpose or do an adaptive reuse of a building, I think that's one of the key areas where you can really add a lot of value. If you're creative and you're thinking out of the box, I'll give you an example. I handle all the zoning work for the Four Seasons Surf Club project up in Surfside. So that was a country club that had been around for decades, and the members simply couldn't afford to keep the club that was 2 or 3 acres on 2 or 3 blocks on the ocean rather. So our client came in and erected these beautiful towers behind the club on the ocean, as you probably know, but at the same time kept the club facilities intact and actually gave each of the members a free lifetime membership to the surf club when the property opened. And so the club and its components were preserved and maintained. The club members got their lifetime membership, and then our client, of course, added tremendous value by adding these Richard Meyer buildings in the back. I think that's the kind of creative and thoughtful, visionary type of adaptive reuses that many of your developers may not be thinking about immediately, but if you think about creative approaches, that'll really add value. And we're seeing the same thing also on Southwest 8th Street. There's a lot of buildings there now that formerly were rundown small apartment houses and are being bought by developers, and they want to convert it into retail on the ground floor and then some other uses above. But I really do think, as I said, that creative approaches to adaptive reuse are tremendous areas where you can make value.
So to follow up on that with you, Alex, and panel, from a developer standpoint, if you're going to repurpose a building, you're going to have to be able to generate more income. Unless you're doing it for charitable purpose, you're going to have to generate more income that's existing. So what municipalities are you seeing where you can upzone existing or rezone existing buildings to be able to get a higher utility financially from them? Well, if you repurpose them versus...
Yeah, that's a tough question.
That's why you paid the big bucks.
I think rezoning is hard, no matter where you do it. But I think you need to have a lawyer kind of examine these issues before you delve into it. I'll give you an example. In Miami Beach, if you want to upzone, it often triggers a citywide referendum. So, it's one thing to go and stand in front of a zoning board or a city council and get something upzoned or make a request for an upzoning, which takes a long time. But certain jurisdictions are really, really strict about it. And unless you want to go through a citywide referendum, which is an enormous amount of money and huge risk, it probably isn't worth the expense. And so you'd have to adaptively reuse the property within the confines of what it is and the building envelope rather than upzoning. I would say some jurisdictions that are more flexible, Sunny Isles is typically pretty flexible in terms of land use changes. They've got a pretty open TDR process, transfer of development rights, where they let you transfer development rights from property blocks away and then add it to the FAR of a property that is several blocks away. I had one situation in Sunny Isles where the city actually allowed the transfer of development rights from a public park. So the city owned a park, and no one's going to build anything on the park. So the concept that there are development rights there is really a bit of a fiction, but the city was willing to have the transfer of development rights as long as you paid them a certain amount of money for those development rights to the city for their coffers. They let you add a substantial amount of FAR to another building.
And to add to that, when you repurpose a building, that building has likely changed in the amount of building that you can have on a piece of property. But if it's a significant building, there is a market for the TDRs, and it'll preserve that building and allow a developer to take better advantage somewhere else.
Okay, so that's a little repurposing. We heard in the previous two panels about corrosion, which is destroying a lot of the older buildings, legacy buildings which are below sea level. So in my world, we're seeing a pretty good amount of, I'm just not going to deal with what's there, tear it down and start from scratch. If you have somebody that wants to do that and wants to start looking at that for a first time, good luck. Where would you recommend they start first? What are the opinions? Architect, contractor, attorney, where do they go first when they I have this and I want to do something else with it because it's no longer functional? We'll start with you.
Well, I always recommend that a good, competent realty team have an architect and a contractor, and also especially an engineer will be brought in by the architect, especially when there's structural issues. So I recommend when a client wants to develop a piece of property or where they have a valuable building that's under disrepair and has not been taken care of for many years, I urge you all to invest some money up front in selling that property and retain an architect and a contractor and a structural engineer to analyze what's there, to give you the real world practical advice that you need before you buy a piece of property, before you sell a piece of property to a client, so that it's something that's viable, that they don't buy the property and at a certain point get the consulting team in and they're told, listen, you shouldn't be doing this. And furthermore, it'll allow you to know what the historical value is of a building through the consult with the architect, and the real world cost feedback of what restoration or demolition, et cetera, would be.
Yeah, I think for as much as in our world, in design and construction, we talk about budgets and costs, it is clear to me over the years of building that the most important resource in any successful project is time. And to me, it's amazing how few people understand what it takes to finish a project successfully, from when you finish your transaction, which is at the closing table, to when I finish my transaction with the client, which is obtaining a certificate of occupancy. I mean, there could be 3 to 5 years or 5 to 7 years in that process, right? So the more value you can add to your client in understanding that timeline, the more informed that client will be to understand, what can be done with that building and what has to start happening. I completely agree with Nati. You need to start building your team, and the client needs to start building a team. And that might sound self-serving, like, bring a contractor aboard. And I'm not saying at a fee or anything like that, but you need to build your network of architects and contractors that know what they're talking about with particulars to the projects that you guys are selling, so that when you put them in front of your clients, they have a realistic expectation, not only on money, but on time. It's amazing to me how at the end of a project, and I'm on the tail end of the project, right? So, there isn't an hour in the day that can be wasted so you can get a CO and start making money on that property. However, there are a lot of things that can be considered from the time you close on that property, whether it be phase permitting with a private provider, which saves a lot of time in the building process, but that needs to be evaluated while you're designing the building. It can't be evaluated after the plans are done, because then it's going to cost you probably another several $1,000s in 6 months. So you need to start considering if a phase permit and a private provider is something that's even feasible to the project. But what I always tell my clients when it's the early phase of a project is, if you even think that it can be an idea, and if you have any questions specifically with regards to phase permitting and private provider, we can go into it a little bit further. But if there's even a possibility of a phase permit and a private provider and going outside of the municipality, start evaluating it like right away. Set up meetings right away. You waste nothing by meeting with these people and understanding what it's going to take to finish the project. If you decide to go a different route, you decide to go a different route. But as time passes, your options become limited. So it's important that you surround yourself and the client surround themselves with as many possibilities to bring the project to a successful completion, which includes budget. But I find time and time again that time becomes the most important resource in a completion of a project.
Time is money.
I would say I guess, you know, the self-serving answer would be hire a lawyer first before you do anything. But that's not, I don't think that's a correct answer. There's a lot of people that are involved in a development project. I definitely think the first person that should be contacted will be an architect. So the architect is able to give you a pretty good understanding of what the zoning code will allow for a particular project. So if you're in adaptive reuse and you've got a building that's 3 stories, you want to do 7 stories or 8 stories, although a zoning lawyer can certainly do that, honestly, we're more expensive. The architect would definitely have the ability to analyze the zoning code and know how many stories can be built. They can also determine what uses are available on the site. Very frequently, there's a need to start having some preliminary discussions with zoning staff and the building department. The architect would normally have those relationships as well. You also would, if you're trying to bring some investors in, the investors, it's very hard to raise money with a blank sheet of paper. An architect could start doing some preliminary renderings of what you want to build and try to attract investors by showing something attractive and nice, and having the investors visualize what could be constructed, and that's oftentimes very helpful in terms of raising capital. So for our clients, typically I find that the architect is a very good beginning. After that, if the issues are more complicated, you need, say, zoning variance or things of that type, you bring in a zoning lawyer. Definitely, once you get past the concept and you know what kind of uses you want what kind of density you're looking for in order to make money, then you turn it over to someone like George to cost estimate the job and see whether it's going to make financial sense based on the construction, the time it'll take, and things of that type. But looking at everything, I would say, generally speaking, the architect is probably the good first person to get on board.
So we're seeing a lot of municipalities around the county that are creating overlay districts to increase density, to do downtowns, to fix, to add more density and more tax dollars. Basically, that's the main function of these for the cities. If you're looking in one of these areas and you decide, I found the building, but I do have to start from scratch because I'm going to be able to double density increase, however, where are pitfalls that you may see in demoing existing, and where would you go first to make sure that you don't have any headaches, and like maybe 1 or 2 of the steps to begin when you're going to, the decision's made, you're going to tear this down, where would you go? Environmental, derm.
You're talking about if you wanted to do a total demo of the project?
Yeah, you have no choice. So it's corroded, it's below sea level, and you can build 3 times what's there now. So we've decided we're going to tear it down. Where do we go?
Well, assuming that you can get assuming you're ready to do a total demo, again, I would say you would certainly want to get an architect to give you that building envelope, to give you an idea of what you could do once you knock everything down. I think that would be very important to do that. And frankly, before you knock it down, you may find that an adaptive reuse is more profitable than doing a total tear down in new construction. Sometimes, for example, there are grandfathered uses and grandfathered setbacks and things like that on a building. And if you tear it down, you lose all the grandfathering. So let's say under an old zoning code, you could build to the 0 lot line, but once you knock it down, you lose those grandfathered rights. Then you got to do 10-foot setbacks and you've lost some property. So before you tear it down, I think you should, it's worth examining what you can do versus what you can do with new construction. The other thing I would mention, which sometimes people overlook, if you're doing something that significant, where you're knocking something down and putting something else new, in many jurisdictions, it really helps to talk to the district commissioner of that area. Because if it's somewhere like City of Miami as an example, they have commissioners by geographic district. So if that commissioner doesn't want that project built, they almost have veto power over whether you want the project done or not. Because you'll bring it to the city council, and then the other commissioners will defer to the district commissioner, because they want the same reciprocity when something else comes up in their district. So you got to keep your eyes on something like that.
And to add to that, in an urban area specifically, where there are significant and not very significant buildings for redevelopment and also open lot areas, somebody that may want to redevelop a historically significant building, and they're saying, well, it's a tear down, it's damaged, et cetera. Everything can be fixed. Everything can be fixed. It's a dollar figure of how much that is. It's very difficult to convince a commissioner or a city to allow something like that to happen when there's other land and other properties that are not historically significant. And we've seen that happen in instances in the city of Miami.
I see some of my industrial cohorts here, and we've seen almost a complete opposite, where a large percentage of the older industrial east and it's creeping steadily west is being repurposed and redeveloped and completely, just redone. I'm doing, for example, in Hialeah, where I'm tearing down an old warehouse and putting up a 5-story apartment building in an area that hopefully will attract plenty of renters, but it's kind of an industrial, what Wynwood maybe looked like 10 years ago.
Right.
So if you're seeing what people coming to you without having to divulge trade secrets, and then I'll ask the audience where they're seeing, where are you seeing more inquiries in terms of work? What are the hot ticket areas where the broker should go start knocking doors and trying to find properties?
I've been on the beach for a long time, and if the
you have a good tan. So.
He does.
Not on the beach, in the beach working. One of the areas, you mentioned as far as being able to tear down, it has to do a lot with the buildings that are there. Just to answer the previous question, by the time you're ready to demolish a building, by that time it's been looked at. We have a demolition plan. On the contractor side, it's fairly easy. You'll check we'll have asbestos reports, and then after you'll look to see if there's possibly any tanks in the ground and things of that nature. But it's pretty mechanical for us as a contractor on that scenario. But as far as areas are concerned, the area of Wynwood is something where you'd be surprised where some of the hotel projects that I'm looking at in Wynwood, and you described your area in Hialeah, it's like, seriously, they're going to put a hotel here? And it looks remote. It looks like there are nothing but very old apartment buildings right next to it. But there are a lot of people with a lot of vision. And then, some of the risks associated with that is you have very tight sites. The foundations on some of these buildings become very complicated, and they become very expensive for a small site. So I think some of the things that need to be looked at, when you're looking at geographic areas, you're typically looking at areas that have more density, right? So your lots start becoming smaller, so you have tighter staging areas. And then if you want to go higher, you need to start looking at, what is it going to take to build that? And then some of the risks that I think are inherent in those projects is if you need to go too low for foundations, for example, because you're going high, dewatering becomes an issue. And dewatering is one of those costs that is very difficult to estimate and control. So if you're not 100% sure as to early on what that site looks like and what you're going to be able to do from a foundation perspective in this example, then you have to have certain contingencies built in until you get those projects going. So I think the areas that are probably the most attractive, the ones that have been historically more dense, carry obviously a little inherent risk with it, right? So it's all about risk and return. You could probably do something cheaper somewhere else, but how quickly are you going to turn around an ROI on that building? So I would look at, the same way you're talking about Hialeah, there are areas in municipalities where you'd be surprised as to how these areas are growing, and I'm talking like luxury stuff and next to very old apartment buildings and small warehouses and things of that nature.
Yeah, I'd say clearly Wynwood is exploding, and that's an area where a lot of people are seeking to develop a lot of properties there, but you're finding that the price point in Wynwood is now climbing very steadily. So 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, you could snap up a lot of bargains in Wynwood, and because it's become so popular, it's becoming a little bit less easy to buy something reasonable. I'd say one area that is still a good bet, and there's a lot of things to purchase, is in the Coral Way corridor as well as on the Southwest 8th Street corridor. It's almost like the hole in the donut, right? So you've got downtown and Brickell have been exploding with development. Coral Gables is just redoing Miracle Mile, and there's a lot of upscale development in Coral Gables. But that artery between Brickell and Coral Gables primarily Coral Way and Southwest 8th Street, has not really gotten the gentrification or the investment that people, I think, would have expected. So what some folks are doing is they're buying properties along Coral Way, and then typically there are these little single-family homes just behind the property that fronts Coral Way, and then they're purchasing the single-family homes from some people who may have lived there for many, many years right in the back of the property, and then the goal is to do some sort of retail, residential, and then a parking garage in the back, and then try to attract some sort of mid-level market renters or persons to purchase. I mean, you're not going to be selling $1 million units on Coral Way, but for a more middle market purchaser, I think there's a lot of opportunity still in that general area. And I know the city of Miami is eagerly looking for investment and is very supportive about getting people in there.
And we've seen, you talked about downtown Coral Gables. If you go one municipality west, the city of West Miami has developed, I mean, I think there's maybe 1,500 apartments
Rentals.
in the corridor, 57th, 8th Street, 67th Avenue, and those, at least for the developer, have done phenomenal. They've made a boatload, that's a good term, of money selling those to tail-end investors. So, and those were all complete by something that's there and exists. So, again, if there are any questions while we're doing this, please raise your hands. Cost analysis, and we kind of talked about this from standpoint where, and you know, Nati and George, this is going to be the questions for you guys. Where have you seen? How fast is cost gone up? And if you crystal ball 12 months in terms of overall, where do you see? And what are the shortfalls of where we're seeing if we're doing construction or repurposing?
Well, I know costs have gone up in the last year and a half. Things that we were projecting to cost $300 a square foot a year ago are now $350, and our clients are, you know, getting shocked about it. And I can only see that it's going to be worse because of the issue with the steel imports until we can catch up in the United States and have that industry happening again. It's going to be a gap where things are going to be very expensive. I saw this happening 15 years ago, the same thing. In the middle of some projects, all the steel prices went up. That means not only the stuff that goes into concrete, but your lights, your light poles, your anything, your doors, your all the products that are made out of steel are greatly affected. So it's a great, and the other thing that's happening right now is that there's so much building going on. It's, you know, the top of the bubble is happening again, and we're concerned about when is that going to keep going up? Is it going to fall again? It's always been a pendulum in my business and in George's business, and I think we need to really study that and advise your clients that they need to plan well for those costs going up.
So I'm a little bit of a cynic on this topic.
Oh,
I think,
no.
well, I think that, look, costs are always threatening to go up unless you're in a recession. The thing is, there's always been something to point your finger at and say, this is why prices are going up, right? So everybody's hair is on fire about the tariffs, which will probably cause some steel prices to go up, and Nati's absolutely right. We talk about rebar, but you know, the construction materials industry is basically a commodities industry, right? When you look at everything that's affected in it, so whenever there's a small price increase in one of these commodities, it makes a big difference. I think it has a lot to do with supply and demand. When there's a lot of demand, prices tend to go up. And then what happens is that there will be something that happens globally or nationally that we point to and say, hey, this is why prices are going up. I remember back in 2004, I think, there was
2004.
There was concrete prices were going through the roof because a plant burned down in China. Oh, a plant burned down in Mexico, and then all the concrete was going to China.
Right, it's the cement.
So the cement price went up. You couldn't even get a bucket of concrete on some projects. But the construction industry was also booming, right? So, and then lumber prices went up and drywall prices went up. And honestly, I just think people get used to the fact that it's a booming economy, it's a booming industry, and you know what? I think we need to make a little bit of money during the good times. Yeah. Now, that being said, in the next 12 months, I would definitely count on some price increases. We're seeing it already from our material suppliers. the steel prices will go up based on the news of the tariffs. Whether it's actually going up or it'll level itself off in the next 24 to 36 months is yet to be seen. I do think that over the long term, these things have a way of building themselves back into the product that you're building, right? So at the end of the day, you have certain material suppliers, subcontractors, and even general contractors that get stuck during the 12-month cycle, right? So if I'm on a project now, and I already bought out my shell package, and that concrete price and that steel price is built into my shell, the person who's going to get stuck is the shell contractor, unfortunately. Yeah. So even though everybody's talking about what's going to happen in the next 12 months, that's kind of baked into the cake. Some people are going to lose money, but depending on your contractual relationships, it's typically not the developer, you know, unless you are in a real cost plus relationship where you can pass those costs on. Some contracts do have some escalation clauses based on unforeseen things that could happen in the world, and tariffs could arguably be part of that. But I think that prices are always going to go up during a good economy in the construction industry. They only level off when nobody's buying anything. So, so I think you can definitely count on an increase in the future, and we'll see where it ends up in the past.
I think certainly this is more of something that George would have a lot more familiarity with than I would. I would just make 2 points in terms of estimating the cost of a project. One is don't overlook the impact fees that can be cited by a city or a county.
Forgot those.
Yeah, because those can be substantial, and if they're not factored in, it could make a significant difference in your pro forma, and could make a project that was profitable, only marginally profitable, or whatnot. Other issue, which is kind of a curveball that some developers find, and this won't apply to a small project, but if you're doing a large project, maybe a ground-up project or a repurpose with a 10-story tower, oftentimes you'll find more aggressive city officials who will ask you for a proffer, will ask you to help build a park or redo a road or something like that as a condition of getting your site plan approval. Some people debate whether that's legal or not, so it's a whole other topic. But normally if a developer wants to get his project done and done fast, and the city's saying, that's fine, but I want you to build a park for $100,000, most of the time a developer will find a way to get that done because they don't want their project stopped for a year. So my point is just kind of keep in mind that could be coming down the road, and when you sit down in front of the city and you want their approval, the recommendation in favor to a city council or whatnot to get something done, it's relatively common you'll find some requests that they want some sort of public benefits to be paid for by the developer as a condition of going forward.
Public benefits package.
Yep.
Public benefits package, yes.
All right. Any questions in the room? We're wrapping. No, look at that.
Oh my God.
Okay. Oh my God.
They're sleeping. I think they were
That's
sleeping.
incredible. All right. Well, thank you very, very much. Appreciate it.